They say I painted the most famous smile in history. They say I was a genius. They say I changed the world. But what they don't say, what they will never understand, is that I died knowing I had failed. Every canvas I left behind, every notebook filled with dreams, every invention that never flew, they were all fragments of a vision I could never complete. I am Leonardo da Vinci, and this is the story of a man who saw everything, but finished nothing. I was born a bastard. Let me say that again, because it matters. I was born illegitimate, unwanted by law, unseen by society. My father was a notary, a man of documents and legitimacy. My mother was a peasant girl whose name history barely remembers. Katerina, they called her, but even that feels uncertain, like a whisper lost in wind. They were never married. I was the accident, the mistake, the child who could inherit nothing. Not land, not title, not even a proper name. In the hills of Vinci, under the Tuscan sun that painted everything gold and shadow, I learned my first lesson. The world does not wait for you to belong. You must carve your own place or disappear into the margins of other people's stories. My father took me into his house, but not into his heart. I was raised on the edges of legitimacy, close enough to see what a real family looked like, but never close enough to be part of it. I watched my father's legitimate children receive educations, opportunities, futures written in ink and sealed with wax. I received silence. No formal schooling, no Latin, no Greek. The languages of scholars, of the church, of power, they were kept from me like secrets, whispered behind closed doors I was not allowed to open. I was left with the language of observation, of dirt under my fingernails, of watching the world instead of reading about it in dead languages describing dead ideas. So I watched. I watched water move in streams, the way it curved around stones, the way it created eddies and vortices, spiraling patterns that repeated at every scale, in rivers, in the curl of hair, in the chambers of the heart. I watched light bend through it like living glass, refracting, reflecting, transforming. I watched birds. God, how I watched birds. The way their wings carved through air, the way they tilted and turned, defying the earth that pulled at everything else with invisible hands. I studied the muscles in horses' legs as they ran, the way power transferred from haunch to hoof. I examined the veins in leaves, nature's own branching architecture, and saw the same patterns in rivers viewed from hills, in the vessels carrying blood through our bodies. I watched the way shadows fell at different hours, painting the same scene in infinite variations, and understood that shadow was not darkness, but another quality of light, subtle and complex and alive. Other children learned their letters. I learned to see. And seeing, I discovered, was its own form of reading, a language older and truer than any written word, a language that could not lie, because it was written by God or nature or whatever force shaped the world into its current form. But seeing comes with a curse. When you truly see the world, not as you're told it is, not as tradition claims it must be, but as it actually is, you can never unsee it. You notice the incorrectness of everything. The paintings in churches with their flat, lifeless figures, eyes that don't actually look at anything, hands that grip nothing, bodies that ignore the laws of weight and balance, the buildings that ignore the mathematics of beauty, the divine proportions that nature uses everywhere, the machines that break because no one understood the principles of leverage and force, friction and resistance, the human body rendered in art like wooden dolls dressed in fabric, when beneath the skin lies an architecture more magnificent than any cathedral ever built. Bone and muscle and tendon working in perfect mechanical harmony, pumping blood, processing air, thinking thoughts, feeling feelings. I began to see a gap, a chasm between what the world was and what it could be. And that gap became my obsession, my torment, my reason for existing. At 14, I was apprenticed to Andrea del Verrocchio in Florence. Florence, the beating heart of the Renaissance, where Medici money poured like wine and artists competed like gladiators in an arena of beauty. Cosimo de' Medici had died, but his legacy lived on in every marble facade, every commissioned fresco, every debate about the nature of beauty and truth conducted in piazzas and palazzos. Verrocchio's workshop was a factory of miracles, a place where art and craft merged into something greater than either. We cast bronze, carved marble, mixed pigments from crushed lapis lazuli and ground malachite and the dried bodies of insects, painted altarpieces that made old women weep and young men dream of glory. I learned everything. How to grind colors to perfect smoothness, how to prepare panels with gesso, layer after patient layer, until the surface was like silk. How to transfer drawings to walls for frescoes. How to mix oils to achieve transparency. How to carve wax models for bronze casting. How to use mathematics to create perspective, that wonderful illusion that made flat surfaces appear to have infinite depth. I learned from everyone. From Verrocchio himself, yes, but also from the other apprentices, from the laborers who mixed plaster, from the merchants who sold us materials and knew the secrets of where things came from and how they were made. But I was not patient. Not really. The other apprentices were content to learn the recipes, the techniques, the established methods. They wanted to know how to paint a thing. I wanted to understand why it looked the way it did. Why does the sky fade from deep azure overhead to pale, almost white blue at the horizon? Why does candlelight make skin glow warm and golden, while sunlight makes it cool and clear? Why can't we capture the exact moment of motion, the wing mid-beat, the smile forming, the tear pouring, the water splashing? Why does fabric fold in certain ways and not others? Why do young faces look soft and old faces look hard? And what is actually different about the skin, the underlying structure? These questions consumed me. The other apprentices thought I was strange. They painted what they were told to paint, collected their wages, went home to their families. I painted what I saw, and what I saw was never enough. Every answer opened 10 new questions. Every technique mastered revealed a dozen more to learn. I began filling notebooks with my observations, writing in mirror script because it felt natural to my left hand, because it made my thoughts private, because I was already learning to hide my obsessions from people who wouldn't understand them. There's a story they tell, perhaps true, perhaps myth. It doesn't matter anymore. Everything becomes myth eventually. Verrocchio was painting a baptism of Christ, a commission for the church of San Salvi. It was a standard composition, nothing revolutionary, but executed with skill and care. And he let me paint one of the angels. Just a small figure in the corner, a supporting character in someone else's drama. I poured everything I had learned about light, about the softness of young flesh, about the way fabric catches and holds illumination, about the quality of attention in eyes that actually see what they're looking at, into that small angel's face. I spent days on those few square inches of panel, building up translucent glazes, studying the way light moved across rounded surfaces, the way it gathered in some places and fled from others. I painted each curl of hair as if it mattered, because it did matter. Everything mattered. When Verrocchio saw it, they say he put down his brushes and never painted again. They say my angel made his own work look dead by comparison, and he couldn't bear it. They say he recognized in that moment that the student had surpassed the master, and rather than compete, he chose to withdraw. I don't know if he truly stopped painting because of me. Men tell stories, and stories grow and change and become what people need them to be. But I know what I felt when I painted that angel. I felt for the first time that I had captured something true, something alive. Not a symbol of an angel, not a representation of angelic qualities, but something that could almost breathe. And I became addicted to that feeling. That moment when pigment and oil on a flat surface somehow transcended itself and became flesh, became soul, became real. I chased that feeling for the rest of my life, and I never quite caught it again, never quite matched that moment of pure achievement. But reality, I would learn, is more complex than any canvas can hold. I left Verrocchio's workshop and entered a world that wanted me to choose: painter or sculptor, artist or engineer, scientist or dreamer. The guild system, the patronage system, the entire structure of Renaissance society was built on specialization, on knowing your place and staying in it. And I looked at these categories, these little boxes society had built to contain human potential, and I said no. No, I will not choose. I will be all of it, or I will be nothing. The human eye that studies light for painting is the same eye that must understand optics, the mathematics of reflection and refraction. The hand that sculpts must understand anatomy, the architecture of bone and the mechanics of muscle. The mind that designs buildings must understand mathematics, engineering, the properties of materials under stress.
The soul that seeks beauty must understand nature, because nature is the only true artist, the only one who gets it right every time. They are not separate. They were never separate. We made them separate, and in doing so, we made ourselves blind, fragmented, incomplete. So I pursued everything. I dissected corpses in the dim light of hospital morgues, in the cold basements of Santa Maria Nuova, the smell of death thick in my throat, my hands cutting through muscle and organ to map the hidden rivers of blood, the delicate machinery of tendons, the cage of bone protecting the mystery of life. I dissected more than 30 bodies over my lifetime. Men, women, old, young, healthy, diseased. I cut them open and drew what I saw with a precision that wouldn't be matched in medical texts for 300 years. The church forbade it. Society condemned it. People whispered that I was a sorcerer, trafficking with death, violating the sacred boundary between life and decay. I did it anyway. Because how can you paint the human form if you don't understand what makes it move, what makes it breathe, what makes it human? How can you render a hand reaching, a leg walking, a face expressing emotion if you don't know the muscles that create those movements, the bones that provide their structure, the nerves that carry commands from brain to flesh? Every cadaver I opened was a book written in meat and blood, and I read them all with hungry devotion. I discovered things that doctors didn't know. I traced the exact path of every nerve in the human arm. I mapped the chambers of the heart and realized it had 4, not 2, as the ancients claimed. I cut away the skull of an old man and saw how the brain sat in its bowl of bone, wrinkled and gray, and somehow containing every thought he'd ever had, every memory, every love, every fear. I drew it all, thousands of drawings, precise and beautiful and true, and no one saw them. They sat in my notebooks, waiting for a world that wasn't ready for them yet. I designed weapons of war for men who would never build them. I needed patronage, needed money to buy materials, to fund my research, to survive. So I wrote letters to dukes and kings, promising them military innovations, tanks that could roll through armies protected by metal shells, bridges that could be assembled and disassembled in hours, portable and strong, giant crossbows that could hurl projectiles with devastating force, cannons that could strike from impossible distances, multi-barreled guns that could fire without reloading, diving suits for underwater sabotage. I took their money and filled my notebooks with nightmares of destruction, all the while hating myself for it. But a bastard cannot afford principles. A bastard takes the patronage he can get and tries to survive in a world that never wanted him to exist in the first place. I sketched flying machines in the margins of everything, wings inspired by bats, by birds, by the membrane of dragonflies catching light. I calculated angles and forces, drew gears and pulleys and mechanisms, imagined a world where human beings could slip the bonds of earth and touch the sky. I designed helicopters centuries before helicopters would exist, aerial screws that would pull themselves upward through air the way screws pull themselves through wood. I designed parachutes, tested them with models, understood the mathematics of falling safely. People called it fantasy, impossible dreams, the ravings of a mind that couldn't focus on practical matters. I called it inevitable.
I knew with every fiber of my being that one day humanity would fly. The birds had shown us it was possible. The mathematics proved it was achievable. We simply lacked the materials, the engines, the accumulated knowledge of aerodynamics. But I knew it would come. I would not live to see it, but I knew. And I drew it anyway, leaving maps for a future I would never reach. And the paintings that consumed me and betrayed me and defined me. I received my first independent commission at 30, the Adoration of the Magi for the Monastery of San Donato. I planned it meticulously, sketched it obsessively, began painting it with all the revolutionary techniques I'd been developing. Multiple vanishing points, figures emerging from darkness, a composition that pulled the eye through space in spirals. It would have been magnificent. I never finished it. I left Florence for Milan, left the painting behind, abandoned. The monks found someone else to complete it. My underdrawing remained visible, a ghost beneath someone else's vision, a promise of what I might have created if I could have stayed focused, stayed committed, stayed in one place long enough to see something through. This became the pattern of my life. In Milan, Duke Ludovico Sforza became my patron. I was there for 17 years. 17 years that should have produced dozens of completed masterpieces. Instead, I produced fragments, promises, incomplete visions. I designed a giant bronze horse for the Duke, a monument to his father that would have been the largest equestrian statue in the world. 24 feet tall, 75 tons of bronze. I spent years on it, years of calculations, of studying horses, of building a full-scale clay model, of planning the casting process. The clay model stood in the courtyard, like a temple to ambition. People traveled to see it. It was magnificent even in clay, powerful and graceful, capturing the essence of equine strength. I had solved the technical problems of casting something so large. I had designed the furnaces, calculated the bronze mixture, planned the molds. We were ready. And then war came. Charles VIII of France invaded Milan. Milan needed weapons more than it needed monuments. The bronze meant for my horse was melted down for cannons. 75 tons of my dream became instruments of death. The clay model stood in the courtyard for years after, slowly deteriorating until French soldiers used it for target practice, shooting it full of crossbow bolts until it collapsed into meaningless mud. I watched my dreams become ruins over and over again. But I did complete one thing in Milan, one thing that people still remember, still visit, still photograph and analyze and write about. The Last Supper, the refectory of Santa Maria delle Grazie, a wall, a commission to paint Christ's final meal with his disciples. I accepted it knowing it would consume me. I had no idea how much.
It took 3 years to paint one wall in a monastery dining hall. The monks complained that I would stand motionless in front of it for hours, days even, not touching a brush, not mixing colors, just staring at the wall as if I could see something that wasn't there yet. They thought I was lazy. They complained to the Duke.
They didn't understand that painting happens first in the mind. I was solving problems of composition, of emotion, of psychology. I was trying to capture the exact moment when Jesus says, "One of you will betray me," and that statement ripples through the group like a stone dropped in still water. How does a man's face look when he realizes he's about to be betrayed? How does an innocent man react to an accusation that doesn't touch him? How does guilt show itself in the angle of a head, the position of hands, the tension in shoulders? How do you paint sound, the moment after words have been spoken and before anyone responds, when everything hangs suspended in shocked silence? I painted each apostle as a distinct personality, each reaction unique and human. Philip rising to protest his innocence, Thomas raising his finger, asking questions even in this moment, James drawing back in horror, John swooning, young and sensitive, overwhelmed, and Judas reaching for the bread at the same moment as Christ, their hands almost touching, the moment of betrayal made visible. I didn't give him a halo of darkness. I didn't paint him as a monster. I painted him as a man who had made a choice and now had to live with it. His face shadowed not by evil, but by the weight of what he'd done. I painted for hours when inspiration struck, working so fast I forgot to eat, forgot to sleep, adding detail after detail until the light failed and I couldn't see anymore. Then I would disappear for days, thinking, observing people in the street, watching how they moved and interacted, taking notes on expressions I saw in markets and churches and taverns. The monks thought I was neglecting the work. I was doing the work. It just didn't look like work to people who didn't understand the process. But I made a mistake, a terrible, irreversible mistake. I experimented with a new technique. Instead of painting into wet plaster like tradition demanded, buon fresco, where you have to work fast and can never revise, I wanted more time, more control, more ability to add layers and make changes. So I treated the wall with a ground, sealed it, and painted on top using a mixture of oil and tempera. It gave me the time I needed. It gave me the control I craved. And it began flaking and fading within my own lifetime. I had tried to transcend the limitations of the medium, to push beyond what was possible, to have my cake and eat it too. And instead, I had guaranteed that my greatest completed work would begin dying as I finished it. The irony was not lost on me. In trying to perfect the process, I had ensured the deterioration of the product. Within 20 years, people were already complaining that it was damaged. Within 50, it was nearly invisible. My masterpiece was destroying itself, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. The universe, I learned, punishes hubris every time. Michelangelo despised me. We were rivals, though I was older, supposedly wiser, supposedly more accomplished. But he was a force of nature, younger, fiercer, full of the arrogance of someone who actually finished things. His David stood complete and magnificent in the Piazza della Signoria, 17 feet of perfect marble humanity, powerful and beautiful, and done, finished, complete, while my works remained scattered, partial, promised but not delivered. We were both commissioned to paint battle scenes on opposite walls in the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence,
A battle of giants, they called it. The Battle of Anghiari and the Battle of Cassina. 2 masters, 2 visions, 1 room. It should have been the artistic event of the century. I designed mine carefully. The Battle of Anghiari, a swirling chaos of men and horses fighting for a flag, muscles straining, faces twisted with effort and rage, a knot of violent motion at the center of the composition. I drew it, planned it, prepared the wall. I even began painting it, using the same experimental technique that had failed me on the Last Supper. Because I never learned, I could never just accept limitations. And I abandoned it again. The experimental technique failed again. The paint ran, or it dried too fast, or it didn't adhere properly. The sources disagree. History is unclear, but the result was the same. Failure. Incomplete. Michelangelo never even started his, but somehow his reputation didn't suffer the way mine did. He was working on the Pope's tomb, on the Sistine Chapel ceiling, on projects that would actually be completed and stand as monuments to his genius. I was the man with potential, with brilliance, with vision, and no ability to manifest it in solid, finished form. He mocked me in the streets of Florence, called me the man who designed a bronze horse he couldn't cast. It was true. Every word was true, and the truth was a blade in my ribs, twisted slowly, deeply, painfully. I wanted to hate him. Instead, I envied him, envied his ability to commit, to finish, to say, "This is done," and walk away without the nagging feeling that one more session could make it better, one more adjustment could make it perfect. I was drowning in possibility, and he was building monuments. Which of us was the genius? Which of us was the fool? And the Mona Lisa. Everyone asks about the Mona Lisa. Who was she? Why does she smile? What secret lies in that expression that has captivated the world for 500 years? Let me tell you the truth. I don't know. Her name was Lisa Gerardini, wife of Francesco del Giocondo, a silk merchant. He commissioned her portrait. That much is fact. Everything else is mystery, even to me. I painted her over years, 4 years, maybe more. I lost count. I carried that small panel with me from city to city, from Florence to Milan to Rome to France, adding layer after transparent layer, refining her face the way water refines stone, slowly, imperceptibly, endlessly. I was trying to capture something I had no words for, the moment between expressions, the face at rest but alive, the presence of consciousness looking out from painted eyes, aware of being observed, responding to it with that subtle, ambiguous expression. Is she smiling? Is she sad? Is she amused? Is she judging? The answer is yes and no and both and neither. She's alive in that paint in a way I can't explain and couldn't repeat. I painted her without eyebrows. They were fashionable then, plucked away, though some say I simply never added them, left her unfinished in that detail. I painted the landscape behind her, misty and strange, with winding roads and distant bridges leading nowhere, mountain peaks dissolving into sky. I painted her hands with the same care I painted her face, the hands that revealed her age, her class, her comfort with being still. I never finished her. I never delivered her to Francesco del Giocondo. He paid me, waited, asked for the portrait. I kept making excuses. One more session, one more glaze, one more adjustment to the corner of her mouth, the transition between her cheek and the shadow behind her, the way light gathered in her eyes. I carried her with me for the rest of my life, unable to let her go, unable to call her complete. Perfection was always one more session away, and I was chasing it like a man chasing the horizon. The closer you get, the further it moves. She hung in my room in France, this small panel containing a woman's face, and I would look at her and see not what I had accomplished, but what I had failed to achieve. The gap between my vision and my execution, the distance between what I saw in my mind and what I could make manifest in oil and wood. This was my disease. This was my gift. I could never finish anything because finishing meant accepting imperfection, accepting limitation, saying, "This is as good as it can be, and I am satisfied." And I was never satisfied. Never. I failed more than I succeeded, far more. For every painting I completed, and I completed perhaps 7, maybe 10, depending on how you count, I abandoned 5 times as many. For every invention I sketched, 100 never left the page. For every question I answered, 1,000 remained unanswered in my notebooks. I was a prophet without a congregation, speaking truths that no one in my lifetime could hear or appreciate or build upon. People think genius is about being right, about seeing what others cannot see, about having insights that change the world. But genius is also a prison. When you can see 1,000 ways to solve a problem, how do you choose one? When every choice excludes all the others, when every path taken means a dozen paths not taken, how do you act? When you can see the flaws in everything, including your own work, how do you ever call anything finished? I was paralyzed by vision, trapped in the space between infinite potential and singular reality. I moved from patron to patron, from city to city, Milan, Florence, Rome, Venice briefly. Each time I promised great works. Each time I delivered fragments. Beautiful fragments, perhaps, but fragments nonetheless. I became known as someone brilliant but unreliable, inspired but incapable of completion. My reputation preceded me, both my genius and my failure to manifest it. In Rome, while Michelangelo painted the Sistine Chapel ceiling and Raphael charmed everyone with his graceful compositions and efficiently completed commissions, I was dissecting corpses in the hospital basement and designing hydraulic systems for the Vatican and getting distracted by the flight patterns of birds outside my window. Pope Leo X, Giovanni de' Medici, son of Lorenzo, a man who had known me for years, said of me, "This man will never accomplish anything, for he begins by thinking about the end before the beginning of the work." He was right. I could see the finished thing so clearly in my mind that the journey to get there felt almost redundant. And yet the journey was everything, and I couldn't walk it in a straight line. I wandered, I digressed,
I got distracted by details that seemed important at the time, and probably were important in some larger sense, but which kept me from completing the task at hand. I was 64 when I accepted the invitation of King Francis I of France, the young king who had just defeated the Italian city-states, who loved Italian art and culture, who wanted to bring the Renaissance north. He offered me a manor house in Amboise, a generous pension of 1,000 crowns a year, and, most precious of all, no expectations. No commissions I had to complete, no deadlines hanging over me, no angry patrons demanding the work they'd paid for. He called me Maestro and asked for nothing but my presence, my conversation, my ideas. He would visit me, this young king, and we would talk about everything, about art, about engineering, about the ideal city, about the nature of water and light and motion. He understood in a way no Italian patron ever had that I was no longer a man of production, but a man of reflection. That the value I offered was not more paintings, but the accumulated wisdom of a lifetime spent looking at the world with open eyes. My painting hand had curled with palsy. My right hand, the hand that had held brushes and pens for 60 years, was now useless, curved like a claw, betraying me at the end. But my left hand, my mirror hand, the hand that had always felt more natural anyway, could still hold a pen.
And so I wrote, even at the end, filling pages with observations, questions, fragments of understanding. I brought 3 paintings with me to France, only 3, after a lifetime of work. The Mona Lisa, St. John the Baptist, the Virgin and Child with St. Anne. 3 unfinished paintings that I couldn't bear to leave behind and couldn't bear to call complete. They hung in my rooms at the Château du Clos-Lucé, and I would look at them, and sometimes I would add a glaze, a detail, a small adjustment that probably no one else would ever notice. In that manor house in Amboise, with the Loire valleys spreading green and tranquil beyond my windows, with spring arriving and flowers blooming and birds building nests, I looked back at my life and tried to understand what it had meant. 7 paintings. That's all I could truly claim as finished. 7 paintings out of 67 years of life. The baptism of Christ, though only the angel was mine. Ginevra de Benci, the Madonna of the Carnation. The Annunciation. The Last Supper, deteriorating even as I remembered it. The Virgin of the Rocks. Actually, I painted that twice, and both versions felt incomplete. The Mona Lisa, forever unfinished. Saint Jerome, abandoned. The Adoration of the Magi, abandoned. Thousands of pages of notebooks filled with observations, inventions, studies, questions. Entire sciences sketched in the margins of my curiosity. Machines that wouldn't be built for centuries. Anatomical drawings more accurate than medical texts that wouldn't be written for 300 years. Theories about geology that anticipated modern understanding. Studies of botany, optics, hydraulics, mathematics. Maps of the human soul through the architecture of the human body. I had lived a dozen lifetimes of curiosity in one mortal span. And what did I have to show for it? An unfinished painting of a woman with an enigmatic smile. A decaying mural of the Last Supper. Notebooks
that no one could read because I wrote backwards in mirror script, naturally, without thinking, in a way that made my thoughts private even to myself. Sketches of machines that existed only on paper. Anatomical studies that would molder in collections for centuries before anyone understood their significance. I had changed nothing, built nothing that lasted in physical form, invented nothing that existed beyond paper and ink. I was a prophet of a future I would never see, speaking a language no one in my time could understand. A man who saw too much, too clearly, too deeply, and couldn't translate that vision into the finished works the world demanded. And yet, in those final months, as spring turned towards summer, and my body grew weaker, and the light through my windows grew more beautiful in ways I could still see, even if I could no longer paint them, something shifted in me, a kind of acceptance, a kind of peace that I had never known in my years of striving and failing and striving again. I began to see my life not as a series of failures, but a different kind of success. I had not built monuments, but I had seen truly. I had not completed great works in the quantities expected, but I had asked great questions. I had not invented the aeroplane, but I had insisted that flight was possible, that the birds were not magic, but mechanics, that what nature could do, humanity could learn to do. I had not finished my paintings, but I had pushed art towards something it had never been before, toward the capture of life itself, of breath and blood and the quick silver movement of thought across a face. I had made oil paint do things it had never done before. I had seen light more clearly than anyone before me. I had understood the human body as a machine more complex and beautiful than any cathedral. Completion, I realized, is overrated. The universe is unfinished. Look at it, still expanding, still changing, still becoming. The human soul is unfinished. We die in the middle of becoming, never fully realized, never complete. Every answer opens 10 new questions. Every discovery reveals 100 new mysteries. Every achievement shows us how much more there is to achieve. I had lived my entire life in that space of becoming, of seeking, of reaching towards something just beyond my grasp. And perhaps that was not failure. Perhaps that was the only honest way to live. To be complete is to be dead. To be finished is to have stopped growing. To be satisfied is to have stopped seeing. I had remained alive, restless, hungry, seeking until the very end. And that hunger, that dissatisfaction, that refusal to accept the world as I found it, that was the gift I could leave behind, even if I left behind no monuments. I thought about the young Leonardo, the bastard boy from Vinci, watching water flow around stones in a creek, asking why. I thought about how far I had come from that child who belonged nowhere, who had no place in the ordered hierarchy of society. And I realized that I had transformed that homelessness into my identity. I belonged everywhere and nowhere. I was painter and engineer, scientist and artist, observer and creator, finisher and abandoner. I refused to be contained by categories, by guilds, by expectations, by the limits of what was considered possible. And that refusal was its own kind of freedom, its own kind of achievement.
the greatest gift you can give the world is not answers. It is better questions. It is the insistence that we can see more truly, understand more deeply, imagine more boldly. It is the courage to look at what everyone else accepts as natural or inevitable or impossible and ask, but why? But how? But what if? It is the willingness to dissect the world, to understand how it works, to sketch machines that don't exist yet, to paint light as it actually appears rather than as tradition says it should appear. I was dying, and I was still asking. My right hand was useless, curled like a claw, but my left hand, my mirror hand, could still hold a pen. And so I wrote, even at the end, filling pages with observations, questions, fragments of understanding. The world outside my window was spring green and beautiful, and I was trying to understand the mathematics of how leaves spiraled around stems, the patterns plants used, the angles nature preferred, the golden ratio appearing again and again in nature's architecture. I would never finish that investigation. It didn't matter. The question was the point. The seeking was the point. The refusal to stop being curious was the point. King Francis, they say, was with me when I died. I don't remember. Memory becomes unreliable at the end, the past and present blurring together. I remember the light through the window, soft and golden, the kind of light I had spent my life trying to capture. I remember thinking about shadow, about how it's not the absence of light, but a different quality of light, subtle and complex, containing colors if you look carefully enough. I remember wanting to add one more glaze to the Mona Lisa's face to soften the transition between her cheek and the darkness behind her, to make her even more alive. I remember thinking I should have tried harder to build the flying machine, to test my theories, to see if I was right about the mathematics of flight. I remember thinking, I am not finished. But then, who is? Who dies satisfied? Who completes everything they dreamed of completing? Who achieves all they hoped to achieve? We all leave unfinished business. We all die in the middle of the story. The question is not whether we finish, but what we do with the time we have. Do we see? Do we question? Do we push against the boundaries of what's possible? Do we leave behind evidence that someone was here, someone who looked at the world with wonder and tried to understand it? They will remember the paintings, I suppose, the handful of completed works that survived my perfectionism and the centuries after. They will remember the inventions that anticipated helicopters and tanks and parachutes and diving suits. They will study my notebooks and marvel at what I saw. Or they won't. Perhaps my notebooks will molder in collections, unread and unappreciated, waiting for a time when the world catches up to what I understood. They will analyze the Mona Lisa's smile until the end of time, seeing in her face whatever they need to see: mystery, wisdom, secrets, femininity, humanity, the eternal feminine, the Renaissance ideal, the captured moment of consciousness. But I hope someone understands the real truth of my life. I was not a genius in spite of my incompleteness. I was a genius because of it. I could never finish because I could always see deeper, farther, truer, because I refused to accept that anything was fully known or fully understood, because I insisted that observation must never end, that curiosity must never be satisfied, that the human mind is capable of more, always more, than we have yet achieved. The moment you think you understand something completely is the moment you stop seeing it. I never stopped seeing. Every painting I abandoned was abandoned because I saw how it could be better, how one more layer could add depth, how one more study of light could make it more true. Every invention I left on paper was left because I understood its limitations, saw what would need to be developed first, what technologies would need to exist to make it possible. Every question I pursued led to more questions, and I followed them all with equal hunger, equal devotion, equal obsession. The world wanted me to be one thing, a painter. That's what they paid me for. That's what they expected. But I couldn't be just a painter. When painting required understanding optics, and optics required understanding mathematics, and mathematics revealed patterns in nature, and nature contained all the secrets of engineering, and engineering could build machines that flew, and flight required understanding birds, and birds were miracles of anatomical design, and anatomy revealed the divine architecture of the human body, and the human body was the greatest subject for painting. Everything connected, everything informed everything else. To separate them was to be blind. I died with my greatest works unfinished, but I lived with my eyes open, and my mind on fire, and my soul in love with the infinite complexity of existence. I lived in the questions. I danced in the space between knowing and not knowing. I painted light as it actually appears, not as we think it appears. I designed wings for humanity's dreams. I dissected death to understand life. I filled thousands of pages with the evidence of my endless, insatiable wonder. The world called me Leonardo da Vinci, Leonardo from Vinci, as if I needed that small Tuscan town to give me identity. But I was never really from anywhere. I was from the space between disciplines, between art and science, between the possible and the impossible. I was from the future, speaking to a past that couldn't hear me. I was from the questions that have no final answers, and that is where I will always live. They say I painted the most famous smile in history, but the real masterpiece was the life itself, unfinished, imperfect, impossible, and absolutely, magnificently, courageously alive. A life spent refusing to accept the world as given, demanding more truth, more beauty, more understanding. A life spent bridging chasms no one else saw, between art and science, between observation and creation, between what is and what could be. In the end, what I learned was this: you don't have to finish to matter. You don't have to complete to change everything. You just have to see truly, love deeply, and refuse to accept the world as you found it. You have to insist on more beauty, more truth, more understanding, more possibility.
And you have to leave behind not answers, but the hunger for answers. Not solutions, but the belief that solutions exist. Not completeness, but the courage to remain incomplete, unfinished, still becoming until your last breath leaves your body. The sketch is more honest than the painting. The question is more powerful than the answer. The unfinished work contains all possibilities, while the finished work contains only one. And I chose to live in that space of infinite possibility, even though it meant never achieving the singular satisfaction of completion. I was Leonardo, and I remained unfinished until the last breath left my body. I died on May 2nd, 1519, in that manor house in France, with the spring light pouring through my windows and the sound of birds outside, those birds I had studied so obsessively, those masters of flight who had shown me what was possible. My last notebooks lay open on my desk, filled with observations I would never complete, questions I would never answer, investigations I would never finish. And perhaps that was my greatest achievement. Not what I completed, but what I dared to begin. Not what I built, but what I envisioned. Not what I finished, but what I saw. The canvas of the world is still wet, still waiting, still becoming, and so am I, even now, even in death. Because ideas don't die, questions don't end. The hunger for understanding that drove me still drives humanity forward. The machines I sketched on paper have been built. The flight I imagined has been achieved. The anatomical truths I discovered are now taught in every medical school. The techniques I developed for painting light are still used by artists. I failed to finish, but I succeeded in seeing. And in the end, seeing is everything. They will look at the Mona Lisa and ask why she smiles. Let them ask. Let them wonder. Let them see in her face the mystery I spent my life chasing, the mystery of consciousness, of presence, of the moment when paint becomes life. Let them never be satisfied with easy answers. Let them always ask one more question, seek one more truth, imagine one more possibility.
That is my legacy. Not the 7 paintings, but the 7,000 questions. Not the completed works, but the insistence that completion is not the point. The point is the seeking. The point is the seeing. The point is the refusal to accept that anything is ever fully known or fully understood. I was a bastard from Vinci, who became the man who saw too much and finished too little. And I would not change a single moment of it, not one abandoned painting, not one unbuilt machine, not one dissection, not one failed experiment, not one obsessive pursuit of an impossible perfection, because that pursuit, that endless, exhausting, beautiful pursuit, was the meaning. Not the destination, but the journey. Not the answer, but the question. The world is still asking questions I first posed 500 years ago. And that is how you change the world without finishing anything. You plant seeds of wonder that grow long after you're gone.
You ask questions that echo through centuries. You refuse to be satisfied, and in doing so, you ensure that no one who comes after you will be satisfied either. I am Leonardo da Vinci. I painted the most famous smile in history. I designed machines centuries ahead of my time. I understood the human body better than the doctors of my era. I saw light more clearly than any painter before me, and I died knowing that I had barely begun to understand the magnificent, terrible, beautiful complexity of the world. The greatest tragedy of my life was not that I failed to finish. It was that I ran out of time to ask more questions. And the greatest triumph of my life was that I never stopped asking until the very end.